So, the president is in Davos, where he couldn't get an invitation for 20 years. And now he's there because I guess they couldn't say no. And we'll see.
You mean he's been trying?
Well, sure, he's been trying to be there for years. It's a, it's a place where the rich and famous hang out, the successful business people, and nobody would give him the time of day there, and now he's there. So, I wanted to start this morning. I actually, I don't know if I need to apologize or not, but I don't want to not apologize if I should. We talked at the last session about Representative Alcee Hastings, who was formerly a federal judge, and we mentioned that he had been impeached, which is true. We also said he had been indicted, which is true, but he was not convicted in his trial. So I actually don't remember whether I said that he was convicted or not, but he was not convicted. And there are a couple of additional interesting facts. Somebody actually asked, I think. It was a trial with regard to bribery, fairly substantial sums, and he had an associate who actually went to jail as a result of the trial. Among other things, the associate did not testify against Hastings. And that was one of the reasons that he went to jail. So, and then as I mentioned, and is certainly the case, he is now serving and has served. He wasn't elected immediately to the House, but he was after 5 or 6 years. And after his impeachment, which came sometime after his indictment. There was a period of time, and he's now in his 13th term from Palm Beach County. So I wanted to be clear about that. Also, interestingly, we mentioned very briefly John Quincy Adams, who was the only sitting president who later went back, I said, to Congress. Well, he went back to the House. There actually is one sitting president who went back to the Senate. Does anybody know who that was? Yeah. No. It was Andrew Johnson, who was impeached by the Senate, by the House, and escaped the trial of the Senate by a single vote. And about 6 or 7 years later, he ran for senator from Tennessee and was elected. He actually died a few months after the election, but he was elected. So that's kind of an interesting historical fact that I think a lot of people don't know. Before we get to this, just a couple of other things about what we talked about at the last, during the last class. We've talked a number of times about the possibility of state prosecution of a witness, maybe whoever. There could be a lot of witnesses or possible people who may be involved in any of these matters that are currently before the special prosecutor or the various judiciary committees. And there's been some conversation, in fact, a fair amount, that, well, if all else fails, the state might prosecute one or more of these people if the crime is a state crime. So one example of that, which is a historical example, is Aaron Burr. You'll remember Aaron Burr was vice president when he, in the duel, killed Alexander Hamilton. He was indicted. Burr was indicted in 2 states, in New Jersey and in New York. He remained vice president and stayed out of New Jersey and New York. And eventually, those indictments disappeared. So he was never
Indicted for murder?
He was. He was indicted for murder in 2 states.
How did the states do it?
I'm sorry?
How could the states have the right to do that?
Well, I believe that he was killed in New York.
Oh, okay.
So I think that was the reason. Well, in New Jersey? All right. So to me, it's all the same, New Jersey, New York.
In the tri-state. He's killed in the tri-state.
Yes, in the tri-state area. He died in New York. So there we go. So somebody must have seen the show. So in any event, but it's interesting to know, you know, he was indicted in both states. He simply stayed out of those states and he disappeared. But the real point I want to make is that there's such a thing in the Constitution as the Supremacy Clause, which states basically that the federal government, federal law, takes precedent over state law in the event of a conflict. It's basically a conflict of laws issue. And many years ago, I don't remember, it may be the case of McCullough v. Maryland. You lawyers will be able to correct me if it wasn't. In any event, in that case, the state of Maryland wanted to impose a tax on the Bank of the United States that was doing business where they were doing business in Maryland. And the Supreme Court eventually ruled that they couldn't tax a federal entity like the Bank of the United States. And there have been a whole series of cases. So it's an interesting question about whether the state might be able to actually indict or try X. And I have read in several places that Trump's lawyers are arguing, basically, putting together arguments, that the Supremacy Clause might very well prevent states from indicting the president going down the line. I just throw that out. I'm not arguing it one way or the other, but I'm saying it's an interesting question, and it's not clear, I can tell you, about, and it might depend on what the crime is, it might depend on what the state is, and so I think we may hear more about that going down the path. Martha?
But after the federal case, a federal case is resolved, then the state could open their case, right?
Well, I think that's not necessarily the case. If, for example, the federal case, I don't know what the outcome would be, but the question would be, could the state reach a separate conclusion? And I think, you know, I don't know what the court would rule, but I think it depends really on what the facts are. But it's not a given that the state courts could proceed without any problem. Yes, sir.
I thought there was a discussion of could states intercede in the event that the president would pardon someone from a federal crime as long as it would be a crime in that state. For example, New York, in New York State, I think money laundering is a state crime.
Yes.
And then, so I thought that initially the question came up not as one of supremacy, it was one of if in the event the president pardoned someone from money laundering
Yes.
in New York, excuse me, pardon someone for money laundering in general.
As a federal crime,
As a federal
could they be
crime.
tried in a state court for the same crime? So my point is that the question is, does the Supremacy Clause apply in such a case? And to the best of my knowledge, there is no case law on that, or at least I haven't found any case law, which doesn't mean there isn't any, but I think that this question, well, that's another interesting question. That's another interesting question. So, just for, that's kind of a point of information that I wanted to make. So, you know, another thing that we've heard a lot about in the last few days is this question of, you know, Trump has now said, you know, I can't wait until I sit down and have tea with Bob Mueller, and it's only a question of, you know, how long I'm going to stay and where it's going to be. And so it's interesting, when Clinton was interviewed by Ken Starr on Monica Lewinsky, it took place in the map room in the White House. It was 6 hours. The only thing I think that Mr. Trump does 6 hours at a time is executive time. So I don't know how he could sit there for 6 hours. I doubt that's going to happen. And it was videotaped to the grand jury because it was in front of the grand jury. So it's not clear to me. I think it's assumed, it's not clear, that this testimony will be in front of a grand jury. I don't know that for a fact. I mean, Mueller could talk to him without the grand jury and then have conversation with him later in front of a grand jury, or he could talk to him with the grand jury. I don't think there's any way that Trump is going to go to the courthouse, and they're not going to bring the grand jury to the White House. So my guess is that if there is a grand jury involved, that it would be through a videotaping procedure, which, as I say, we have seen before. And remember, we have two unanimous Supreme Court decisions, one in the Nixon case and one in the Clinton v. Jones case, that have said that these kinds of interviews and subpoenas, if necessarily, are legal and constitutional. So I think there's no question about the process, but we'll see what happens. My guess is, well, I think between now, between the cup and the lip, I think we're going to see a lot of this. I don't think that it's, first of all, he's got so many lawyers, I don't know to whom he's talking and whether, who's making the decisions. But my take is that whoever is going to take charge of this will try, obviously, their best to shorten the time, limit the topics, etc. And we'll see what happens.
Who's paying for his lawyers?
Well, you know, the answer to that is, I think it's unknown. He's clearly supposed to pay for his lawyers, but, you know, we had, we read just in the last week, whatever happened to the $100 million from the inaugural fund? You know, nobody can find $50, $60 million. It's disappeared, at least that much. And
he pledged his salary.
so, well, yes, we've seen, as best I know, one check. So he's been in office a year. I don't know what happened to that paltry sum, that, as far as he's concerned, paltry sum. And so I don't know. Theoretically, you know, the Republican National Committee could pay the legal fees if he asked them to. So I don't know. George?
Do we know who paid for Clinton and Nixon's lawyers?
I can't tell you off the top of my head.
I think they did.
I think.
Yeah.
They, as a matter of fact, when they left the White House, the whole business was they were broke, and they owed something like 10
Yeah.
or 11 million dollars in the legal fee.
I think that's a good
Right.
point. Good, thank you. Yes. And,
That's why they had to do so many speeches
Yeah.
right,
afterwards.
Write
right,
books.
Yeah.
right. And form a foundation.
And form a foundation.
Right. Okay. So, one other thing that I didn't mention that I think is just interesting to know is that, you know, when Ken Starr was appointed as the independent counsel, there was a 3-judge panel that was appointed as part of this process. Actually, it was the panel that appointed Starr. The judges were retired federal judges. And the guy who was the chief of the 3, the senior of the 3, who basically made all the decisions, was a federal judge from North Carolina, whose name was Santel, last name was Santel. He was a very close friend of Jesse Helms. And he was appointed because Helms wanted him appointed. To give you an idea, he named his daughter Reagan Santel. So to say that he was a conservative is to put it mildly. But theoretically, the decisions that were made with regard to financing and had to be done under the auspices of this 3-judge panel. Now note, that disappeared with the, we don't have any judge panel with this special prosecutor.
Who appointed them again?
Well, it was an appointment by the Senate.
Okay.
And there were 3 judges, actually. It was a 3-judge panel. So I have a question for you. You know, after 9/11, we had an independent commission that was formed by the Congress. You remember that? I believe it was either 10 or 12 quote-unquote distinguished citizens. Right. I think a former governor of New Jersey, I don't remember which one, was the chair. But their job was to get the facts. And they convened for, I think it was at least a year and a half, if not a couple of years. And they had witnesses and et cetera. And they prepared a report, which was delivered not only to the president, but to Congress and to the American people. Many people felt they did an excellent job. And prior to the time that Muller was appointed, there was some conversation about establishing an independent commission. We now have the Judiciary Committee in each house investigating this. We now have Mr. Mueller doing his thing, and in the last month, particularly in the last couple of weeks, we have these conspiracy theories that are being tossed onto the fire by mostly Republican groups who are basically trying to undermine the investigation by undermining not just Mueller, but the FBI and that whole thing. When I heard Senator Johnson last night from Wisconsin, I was reminded of another Republican senator from Wisconsin back a number of years ago, who famously said, I have a list of 135 people who are in the CIA who are communists, members of the Communist Party. And of course there was no such list, and there were no such people, but that didn't make any difference. So I don't know, is there something in the water in Wisconsin?
And they're from the same, if not town, area, because Appleton is where McCarthy was from, and I think this joker is too.
What did he say
Janesville?
last night?
Oh, no, that would.
Well, he said that he had he had a report or information that there was a cabal inside the FBI that was set up, a secret society. Dan Brown, a secret society, a 1,200-page book, saying that, that was set up to basically destroy the Trump presidency. There are 35,000 members of employees of the FBI. There's one a political appointee, the guy who's at the head, in this case the guy. So, I mean, what they're doing to the morale of the FBI must be absolutely unbelievable. And I think, who's the, not the chief, but who's the guy that they're... McCabe. I don't know how McCabe is going to be able to hang on here. But anyway, my question to you is, what do you think about the merits of an investigative or an independent commission now? Does this make, would this help? Would this hurt? Would this confuse?
It's hard to imagine that they could put together an independent commission with the entire country being so tribal. How do you find independent people?
How do you find a jury or an investigative body? So what, I think, other comments about this? I mean, yes, Dan.
I think the public perception at this point is appropriate, and that is that the two houses of Congress really have not done their job in terms of carrying out a proper investigation. There's been information withheld from a minority party. There have been investigative tentacles that haven't been followed up, and they have essentially disgraced themselves. On the other hand, Mueller's commission continues to enjoy a lot of confidence on the part of the public. If anything, the liberal side of the equation is completely convinced that he's the only hope. If you threw an independent commission into the mix, you just muddy the water even further. So the common thinking, it would seem to me, is let this guy play out, withstand the kind of besmirchment that's being thrown out by the Republican Party to try to undermine them, and see what happens. He should come up with more indictments.
But there are two different things being investigated, supposedly. One is the influence that the Russians or whoever had on the election, and what do you do to make sure that doesn't happen again? That was what I thought the Senate and the House were looking into. I thought Mueller was looking into what were possible criminal actions.
The obstruction of justice issue, or what most people have been calling collusion.
But the issue of blame more than the attitude of what happened and how do we prevent it from happening again. So that might be something that is not being addressed properly. They're all getting stuck in the blame business.
But do you really think that a Republican Congress is going to go along with the idea of an independent commission that investigates the electoral process?
The point is not whether or not you can do it, but the point is, should it be done? Should there be something
Who
that
would or could possibly appoint?
Exactly.
Well, I think the appointment, first of all, we know, let's take one thing off the table. The president is not going to appoint an independent commission. Right. So that leaves only Congress. They could do it. I say could. I think, a couple of points have been made. When I say could, I mean theoretically they could. Are they positioned at this point to do that? I think, they don't seem to be positioned to do much of anything at this point. So I think the likelihood of it's happening is probably remote. If you try to think of someone, a person who they could get to lead such a thing, there could not be a member, I say could, it shouldn't be a member of the Congress. So who do you find who's a person of national stature who they could find to be the chair, and then find another 10 or 12 people willing to sign on to take the heat? And
Well, that's interesting.
Michael Bloomberg.
Michael Brady. Okay.
Tom Brady.
Tom. So, there are 3 suggestions, and anyway, I think you know, there was a call early on. It's since died down, and we haven't heard much more really about it. Well, I wanted to go back for a minute to the question of impeachment, because I think that there are some additional points that are worth making here. And I have this, this is in, obviously, in Article 1, and I want to read this to you. It's not long, you can read it for yourself, but there are a couple of key questions that come out of this that I'm not sure we've talked about that I think are interesting and perhaps important. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office, comma, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So let's stop at that point for a minute. Remember, we said that there were two steps that the Congress could take in an impeachment case, and we were talking principally, of course, about the federal judges who have been impeached. And there are a number of them. So does this say to you that the removal from office and disqualification are one and the same? Or does this say to you that these are two separate actions?
Two actions.
Because of the comma.
No, it's a semicolon.
So do you think these guys in Philadelphia put this in? I mean, you know, did they say two separate actions will have a comma? Or did this somehow slip in? Did, I don't know, Jim or somebody slip in this comma because he thought it was better? No, this is in the original.
Practice, Dave. Hasn't the practice been generally just to impeach?
The practice has been.
Add on.
That's correct. There have been, that's correct. There have been a number of federal judges who were disqualified in a separate vote. But there have been no cases on this, and people have raised the question as to whether, as to really what was meant here. Did they mean it to be two separate actions? Is this important? Well, it's important if you're being impeached. And as we know, Alcee Hastings went back and held office. So because they did not go take the second step and disqualify him. So that's kind of one interesting question. The next one, let's go on. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment, 4 separate steps according to law. Remember, here's a colon. But the party convicted. So, does this suggest that the impeachment must come first? Or is this simply an acknowledgement that the party being impeached can nevertheless be liable and subject to all of these things prior to not necessarily after. You understand the
Yes,
question?
yes.
But it says, but the party convicted, which implies that that
After.
event has occurred, and it's so, right there.
But the party convicted.
And that's referring to the first
Right.
impeachment.
Convicted of impeachment.
Is it
Convicted of
Yeah.
Well, but what if he's not, what if he hasn't been convicted?
It doesn't
Subject
apply
to
then.
that.
No, it doesn't, it
Doesn't
doesn't.
apply,
It'd be
they
a
can
stretch
still.
to
Well-
say- It would be quite a stretch to argue that because you didn't get impeached,
But
now
you-
you are above the law.
Yeah, because impeachment is political, and the following things are judicial, or
Or
legal.
legal? Yeah. So this is the subject, has been the subject of some very interesting debate in the legal journals over the years. And interestingly, in let me see if I can find this, because I think, where are you? In 1997, Georgetown Law School held a forum. What happened to this? On this question. And there were, I haven't got it here, but I know it is here. There were 6 panelists who were constitutional scholars. And this was the point of the forum. Can the president be indicted prior to his impeachment? That was the question. Can the president be indicted before his impeachment? 6 constitutional scholars. It was actually just prior to the Clinton v. Jones case, but it was clearly related to the proceedings that were going on at that time. And of the 6, and it's not important at the moment who they were, but there were 2 who said no. There were 2 who said yes. There was 1 who said, well, he could be indicted for civil and not for criminal. And there was 1 who said, because he can pardon himself, there's no point in asking the question. So that's an example of the consensus, exactly, that we have in the legal community. And I think it's, again, no point in us kind of rehashing any of that, but I would suggest to you that we haven't come a lot further in the last 20 years. We're basically still at this interesting point where that issue is unresolved. Now, both in the Nixon case and in the Clinton case, with Starr and with Jaworski, the second prosecutor in the Nixon case, they both thought that the president could be indicted. They both felt that their position was he could be indicted. But, and I think I underline the but, this is important, they also felt that there was a better way to proceed in each of those cases. And Jaworski felt actually, he had discussions clearly with members of Congress who were ready to move on impeachment. So Jaworski pulled back from the thought of indictment, waiting to see what would happen with the impeachment, and of course the president then resigned. With the case with Ken Starr was, again, he thought he had the right to do this, but the way things developed, he decided that it was not the proper approach at this time. Dave?
But wasn't the feeling at the time also that once the impeachment was over that he would have been indicted?
I'm sorry.
Excuse Nixon.
That Nixon would have been indicted after the impeachment, and that was the need for its pardon.
Well,
But a pardon,
Sheila?
accepting the pardon presumes guilt. doesn't it?
Was what?
Presumes guilt, I mean.
Well, that's another, of course, interesting question that we've raised here. You know, does that, remember, Nixon did get pardoned. And so, no, not by himself. And if you go back to the words, incidentally, of that, remember we've gone back to these words several times, for any crime committed within a certain time frame, I think a 5-year time frame, and any other crimes he may have committed. So during the testimony of a congressional hearing, former Representative Elizabeth Holtzman from New York asked then President Ford, can we pardon somebody? Can somebody be pardoned without a specific crime being mentioned? And any other crime that may have been committed, a blanket pardon, one kind of a. Holtzman asked this question: can you pardon someone without specifying the crime?
That's pertinent now.
What's happening on the 22,000 pardons? Has that ever happened?
Well, I haven't read them all. I'm in the middle. But this is another question to which we don't have an answer. And one reason we don't have an answer is that what Ford did have, what had been given to him by his staff, and actually came from the Department of Justice, was a list of 10 possible crimes that Nixon might have been accused of. Perjury, obstruction of justice, a whole bunch of things. And what Ford basically acknowledged was that they didn't know, or he didn't know, which of these crimes Nixon may have been guilty of, but the pardon that he had given covered these crimes. Now, query, what if he hadn't had that list? What difference would that, if any, had made? What about Elizabeth Holtzman's question? I've seen her interviewed a few times in the last 6 months. Very smart lady. And about this specific question. And, you know, she said Congress never got an answer to that question, not only from Ford, but from anybody else. The question has never really been addressed. So that's yet another open question for the court. When, as, and if this ever moves, anything ever moves forward.
And just remind me, how did they calm down the whole Clinton thing? I know he was going to get counseling from Jesse James.
What?
Remember when he announced that?
Jesse James?
Jesse, who was it?
Jackson.
Jesse Jackson, right.
Well, Jesse Jackson, wow, yes. A long way from Jesse James.
Personal.
Right, right. So, well, I mean, what happened was, Clinton, went back to work. I mean, and, when he left office, he had a very high level of popularity. That last day, when he pardoned, 175 people, didn't help him. Actually, another interesting fact, one of the pardons that he gave on the last day he was in office was to remember we talked about Alcee Hastings, the guy who went to jail because he wouldn't testify against Alcee Hastings was pardoned by Clinton on the last day, was one of the people who was pardoned on the last day of his
Did he also pardon his own brother?
He did. He did. And he pardoned Hillary's brother as well. So it's all in the family, as they say. Okay. So let's move along a little. I want to talk a little bit at this point about this idea of a full-blown constitutional crisis. What do we mean by that? We hear it in the press. I've used the term occasionally, maybe more than occasionally. How does that play out? What do we mean by that?
Just had one.
Well,
3 days ago.
okay. So what happened?
Everything stops.
Well, okay, that's one kind of a crisis. The government shuts down. Now that's about, I think I recall, 18 or 20 shutdowns we've had in our history. Most of them, half of them last 2 or 3 days. The longest one we ever had lasted almost a month. We've had half a dozen in the last, 12, 13 years. So, yeah, those are pretty bad, pretty silly. But I think when we're talking about the question of pardon, impeachment, indictment, obstruction, we're talking about something else.
Who's in charge?
Okay, who's in charge? I'm in charge, right. General Haig, and the whole country shuddered. Al Haig, woo. Secretary of State, don't worry, I'm in charge. Woo. So let's assume, let's follow a path here. Let's assume that Trump decides that he wants to get rid of Rosenstein. Here's another, okay, we'll come back to Rosenstein. At the moment, Sessions is there, who is recused. How does Trump get rid of Rosenstein?
He has Sessions do it.
Yeah, Sessions is good.
So he says to Sessions, fire Rosenstein, and no, I don't think that Sessions can fire Rosenstein at this point. What he does is he says to Rosenstein, the president can fire Rosenstein.
Right.
But how's that going to help? Because he can still talk.
Well, he can talk, but he's no longer responsible for the Muller probe. And then what he could do is, what the president could do is, it's Rachel Branch, who is the next gal down. He would go to her and say, who did you vote for? Right. And then, he might or might not fire her. And then the third person down the line is the Solicitor General. And then, actually, there's another line. There are 3 U.S. attorneys who have been designated by the president as being next in line in the Attorney General's office. They are, I believe, in order, the U.S. Attorney for L.A., the U.S. Attorney for D.C., and the U.S. Attorney for Chicago, for that Northern District of Illinois. I don't have their names in my mind, but the U.S. Attorney in D.C. is a pretty liberal person. The U.S. Attorney in L.A. is relatively liberal. The guy in Chicago is a very far-right type. So there are like 6 layers here of people he could go to in order to find somebody here. And then he could do one of several things. He could, once Rosenstein is gone, the question is, what happens to the probe? What happens to there is no special prosecutor. So how do we get another special prosecutor? Sessions is recused. So Trump isn't going to appoint another special prosecutor.
Do it through Congress.
So, well, I don't know that Congress can appoint a special prosecutor in the Attorney General's office.
Well, they could appoint an independent commission.
Well, they could do that, or they can appoint a whole new, they can come to a whole new, start a whole new probe. I don't see that happening. I think the question is, do they replace Rosenstein, or do they shut the whole thing down? And that, I think, is what we are talking about when we're talking about a constitutional crisis. Because I think we would see some very fired up people in the country in terms of if Muller had been fired by one of these people, which would be if Trump says to Rosenstein, I want you to fire Muller, and Rosenstein says no, then he's gone. If Branch says no, then she's gone. If the Solicitor General says yes, then Mueller's gone. George.
What was Robert Bork's position?
He was Solicitor General.
He was Solicitor General?
He was.
Well, why would the same steps not be followed in this situation?
Well, it's not that the same steps wouldn't be followed. We've got a different cast of characters, and Cox was appointed under a different set of rules. So that's the basic reason. Because now, under the rules that Mueller was appointed, and I think I read them to you earlier in the week, there are a series of things for which he can be fired, but one of those series is, or for any other good reason. So, what am I talking about here? Yes,
Wasn't Archibald Cox appointed as wasn't that whole thing an independent commission?
No, it was not an independent commission. He was a special prosecutor, but he was appointed under a different set of rules. So, so that's, yes.
Could any of them in this sequence of possible people who could fire Mueller? I thought that the conclusion of the series of cases that we read about was that, in fact, it couldn't fire the special counsel, but they could disband the grand jury as long as they don't go and hire somebody else to then fill that.
Well, I think that follows from, in other words, if there's no more special prosecutor, then, what happens to the probe? And what happens to all the materials? What happens to, all of this, everything that's gone on before? And I think, so to me, this question is the heart of what we talk about as a full-blown constitutional crisis. Yes, Dave?
If Mueller comes out with a series of indictable types of information and presents it to Congress, which is what his obligation is, and then they fail to proceed with impeachment proceedings, does that not constitute a constitutional crisis?
Well, I wouldn't disagree. Just a couple of notes, I think we said earlier that Mueller actually can't present the report to Congress. He has to present it to Rosenstein. And that is a big difference. Cox could report directly to Congress. Rosenstein can't. So he has to go through Rosenstein. Theoretically, Rosenstein can look at this report and say, there's not enough here to proceed to the grand jury. And interestingly enough, if the grand jury has been involved, and it's already involved, the law, correct me, you legal bagels, if I'm wrong, the law says you don't present a report to a grand jury or to the prosecutor. Basically, the indictment speaks for itself. So it's the indictment from the grand jury that would be used to go forward if, in fact, there was an indictment. But the report from Mueller would probably come before the indictments, probably. Maybe just before, but they would probably come before. So, one, Mueller theoretically can't report or can't release the report to Congress without the approval of Rosenstein or whoever is sitting in that position.
But the grand jury doesn't have a head, and therefore the indictment itself is promoted by the prosecutor.
By the prosecutor, that's correct.
So if Mueller goes and he suggests an indictment, and they issue an indictment, and then he reports on the findings that he had that support that.
Yes.
You could conceivably have an indictment out there against the president with no information provided as to why.
I think that's yes. I think
That
that's
would be
possible.
Price's way.
Yeah, I think it would be. Sheila.
The thing that I was referencing was in
Good for you.
Nader v.
Board.
The instant regulation contains within in its own terms the provision that the Watergate special prosecutor, as opposed to any particular occupant of that office, will continue to carry out his responsibilities until he consents to the termination of that assignment. This clause can only be read as a bar to the total abolition of the office of Watergate special prosecutor without the special prosecutor's consent.
That is correct in that case. That is not the language with the appointment of Mr. Mueller.
Thank you.
That's the differential.
Because I would have been left with that.
So, and I think we also said that the Department of Mueller is appointed under DOJ rules as opposed to those rules which Cox was working under, and these rules don't have the force of law, and they don't have to be precedent. Doesn't have the same effect. So theoretically, the DOJ could make another regulation or choose not to follow its existing regulation. I suggest to you that it's not impossible to believe, given the current Department of Justice, that they might not follow their own regulation, or that they might try to, in some way, move in another direction. Michael.
Doesn't this ultimately end up in the Supreme Court as the election of 2000 did? I mean, just an example.
Well, I think the answer is it could in a number of ways. I think one of the things that unfortunately, one of the things I've been trying to suggest to you since we started is that the most important questions regarding almost all of this, from pardons to impeachment to indictment to firings to hirings, are questions that have really never reached the Supreme Court or have not been effectively decided. There are some things. The Nixon case, the Clinton v. Jones case, we know that the president can be served, et cetera, that a subpoena requires him to talk, but a lot of these other things are unresolved. So could there be a case in the Supreme Court? Absolutely. Could there be more than one case in the Supreme Court? I suggest to you there could be. And where those cases would start is probably in the District Court of Columbia, because that's where all of this activity has taken place. They would be then appealed to the Circuit Court in the District of Columbia, and then they would go to the Supreme Court. And they would undoubtedly be fast-tracked in some way once the District Court had ruled. But how long it would take, actually, of course, the case in 2000, you know, they got to it in a big hurry, and the decision was pretty quick. They could move pretty quickly. Whether or not it was the right decision is something we could have another whole class about, couldn't
Well,
we?
if you impeach the president, I would think it would go up there pretty damn fast.
Well, I would think, well, impeached him, impeached him is, you know, what do we mean by that? Because that's a process. The House has to actually bring a bill of impeachment. Then the Senate has to hold a trial. That could take months. That's not going to happen in a hurry, and it's arguable, I think, given the current Congress, that ain't going to happen at all. This House is not going to bring a bill of impeachment against the president. At least I believe they wouldn't do that now. And even if they did, the likelihood of getting 2/3 of the Senate to convict is non-existent. It couldn't happen now. Now, if in November, there's a sea change in the Congress because of the midterm elections, that might shift the House and maybe even some of the Senate. Would they be able to get 2/3? I think that's really a stretch. So I think, Mike, all I'm saying is, you know, what do we really mean by impeachment here? You can bring an action for a bill of impeachment, but actually getting that impeachment, I think, is really a difficult question.
When does the public see, let's say, Muller is gone, he's done, he's given his report to somebody. When do we
Get to see them.
get to see what's in there?
Well, I'm not sure. My guess is that there wouldn't be a long time. I mean, you know, this business we've heard today, Johnson, you know, about the Senator Johnson, about the cabal, and Nunes saying he's got this 4-page memo that apparently he prepared. And I saw an interesting piece, Adam Schiff from California, who's on the House Judiciary Committee, and Intelligence Committee, thank you, made a comment that in a meeting of the committee, he made a motion that the House members of the committee, I think there are 12 or 13, and of course the Republicans have a majority, that everyone read the underlying documents leading to this 4-page memo.
And enter it into the record.
And
Read it to decide whether.
And enter it into the record. And every Republican voted against that motion.
They wouldn't even read it.
And none of the Republicans have read the underlying documents. So that being the case, let's assume for a minute he was telling the truth. I've got no reason to believe he would lie about anything like that. So if they won't read the documents on which they are now flying a memo trying to tell everybody of all of the problems, then the likelihood of releasing information to your question is a little hard to say. I think in the case of Muller's report, we would see it sooner rather than later. I mean, clearly, the public would be entitled to see this.
Couldn't somebody move to have it sealed? Or, I mean,
You can believe it.
Well, that's certainly possible. If it's remember, this is not, you can seal, I think, for some period of time, indictments from the grand jury. But the report from the special counsel, I think, would be something that would be difficult to keep secret.
What's supposedly in the 4-page document again?
Well, it's, I'm not clear, but it's, you know, Nunes was the guy who, you know, ran down to the White House at midnight. I don't know what he was doing on the grounds carrying on down there, but somebody said it was like the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I don't know. But I don't think anybody knows. Basically a series of allegations that he has developed based on certain underlying documents of which nobody has seen. So,
Allegations against the FBI?
yes, against the FBI, principally. Right. Email, secret society.
Basically, they're doing this to give to the Republican-leaning media, Rush et al., who say we can't trust anything that the FBI and Justice are saying because, and this is Rush's argument, because these are the same people who falsely brought us the weapons of mass destruction as a precedent for the Iraq War and convinced poor George to invade
Poor
Iraq.
George.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a break to that. So we have a few things left to talk about. I want to talk about the rule of law. I want to talk about, can the president pardon himself? And then, but before we get to those two things, I'd like to chat with you about something I don't think we've really mentioned much, the 25th Amendment. So I think you'll, let me see if I can bring this up. I think you may remember that the 25th Amendment is the amendment which talks about succession in the event of the disability of the president. And this happened after Kennedy's assassination, although it certainly could have happened earlier. And so the most interesting pieces of this occur in section 4 of the amendment itself. And basically what happens is this. It talks about disability. And one of the issues, of course, is what do we mean by disability? You know, if you're out of your tree, does that mean you're disabled? So what this basically sets out is a series of events. The vice president takes over if and when he and 2/3 of the cabinet declare the president to be disabled. Wow. 2/3 of the cabinet. 2, the president can respond that he is not disabled. That wouldn't surprise me. But the vice president and cabinet can object within a 4-day time period. Question: who's in charge during those 4 days?
Alexander Haig.
Don't worry, I'm in charge. What if the vice president says during those 4 days, I'm going to fire these guys and hire a whole bunch of new cabinet secretaries? Or what if the president says that? Can they do that? Another constitutional crisis. So, if there's no objection, if the president says I'm not disabled, and no objection, then the president gets his power back. Does that mean that he's lost it during that 4-day time period? If they do object, if the president does object, the vice president stays in control while Congress deliberates. Well, that's, whoa. I mean, how long is that going to take? Well, The vice president keeps the power indefinitely only if Congress votes within 21 days. That's a long time down there. A 2/3 majority in both houses that the president is disabled. And then there is a section here that says that Congress at some point can substitute another group for the cabinet, but they've never done that. So I think, you know, this is an interesting, this is another one of these interesting questions. What's the succession currently in the cabinet? Who's, if the president, something happens to the president, the vice president takes over. If something happens to the vice president, who would sit in the president's chair? No.
No, oh no, it's the cabinet, it's either the secretary.
It's the president pro tem of the Senate, Orrin Hatch. President Hatch, who's announced his intention to step down from his Senate seat. He hasn't done that yet. And my guess is that Senator Hatch, if he were to become president, would probably want to stay there for a while. So what happens after Hatch?
Not Paul Ryan.
Yes, after
I thought Paul.
you know, my notes say Paul Ryan. So I take it back. I'm sorry. I thought I take it back. It's Paul Ryan, then Hatch. So you have your choice. Then, yeah, the secretaries of the various offices. The first one is State,
Right, and then.
Tillerson, then Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin. Woo. Then we'd have Mattis, Sessions, Zinke. He's the Secretary of the Interior. Sonny Perdue. No relation to the chicken guy. And then, of course, the guy who was asleep the whole time, Wilbur Ross, who was also in Davos. I'm sure he's sleeping somewhere there, but I don't know where. So he's the Secretary of Commerce, and he was the bankruptcy king. He made his billions by buying up bankrupt companies, breaking the unions, throwing all the pensioners out, and then reselling these companies for big dollars. Yes, Sandy.
Nobody there has a spine, okay? So why do we even, this is so theoretical. I mean, Ryan couldn't even make a comment when the president made racist statements about countries. I don't think any of these guys have a spine. I don't think you get anywhere near there. If he knifes his wife or something, then they might do it.
Well, I think the question here is, I think I sent you an email. I asked a question.
Yeah.
So the question, one of the questions I asked was about the 25th Amendment. How could we use the 25th Amendment to remove the president?
But the way this is, with the vice president being in charge, he could be essentially conducting a coup. I mean, if he...
Well, it doesn't have to be a coup, does it? Maybe it's a deal that the president makes and says to the vice president, I'm not going to pardon myself because my lawyers tell me that it'll look bad. So here's what we'll do. You'll say I'm incompetent. I'll step down. You'll pardon me. And then I will return. To use Douglas MacArthur's famous, I shall return. Thank you. I shall return. So, I mean, is that possible?
No.
No, because it's not possible, or no, because it's not possible?
No.
Plausible or possible?
No, because he wouldn't trust him to give the power back.
Okay.
That's not gonna happen.
Pence would never do.
Well, so I think, you know, in these days of extraordinary events, I suggest to you it may be implausible, but it may not be impossible. And it is a way around the question of a self-pardon. So, as I say, I mean, you know, I may have had one drink too many when I thought about this, but Dave?
In these events and the events that are going on now, it becomes crystal clear the whole concept or the whole argument that's been made over the last 50 years about the imperial presidency. And the question that I would ask of you is that, having reflected on it at this point, to what extent do you think that this is a sobering moment in history that will constitute or promote changes going forward in terms of how the president is perceived and what his rights and privileges?
The president, quote unquote, the office of the president. So I think that's a very interesting and important question. And how many hours do you have? Can we hold that and come back to it toward the end? Because I think that it's a worthwhile, I think it's a key question, because I think what we've seen, it's hard to say exactly when this happened. It didn't happen at a moment in time, but over a period of time. And I think it may have begun with the election of Jack Kennedy, but because he lived such a short time in that office, I think the momentum slowed. I think when Reagan came in, this was another moment when this imperial or unitary president began to develop. I also think that this goes along with what's happened in Congress. There was a time in Congress when we had senators on both sides of the aisle and some congressmen who, while you knew where they stood, these were people who put country over party and policy over politics. And I think those days in the Congress have disappeared. Whatever you think of Ted Kennedy, he was one of the few senators who had won a national audience. Almost as many people disliked him as liked him, maybe more in some places. But he was a guy who was able to talk about national issues in a way that was relevant to many people. And we don't have anybody in Congress like that anymore. Nobody. And he wasn't the only one. I pick him out because I've done a course on him and I know more about him. But you know, even guys on the other side, guys like Bob Taft, guys like even Bob Dole, who was never my favorite, but you know, who was a guy who was basically a tough SOB, but he understood what it was like to be to have country over party. Everett Dirksen is another one. I mean, there were many. The Rockefeller Republicans who have long since disappeared. And so I think that I think those two things go hand in hand. The presidency has been elevated in American politics because of the personalities of some of the individuals, because of the unbelievable media coverage that these people get, and in particular, I think, with the development of social media, which is, you know, I don't even pretend to understand all the ramifications of that, but you know, I mean, you walk into a restaurant, the other night we walked into a restaurant, there are 6 people sitting at a table, adults, and each one of the 6 people is looking at their phone. I don't think they said a word to one another during the entire conversation. I don't get this, but this is the way the world is. People crossing the highway, you know, looking at their phone. Cars are coming by. I mean, it's just amazing to me. So that's maybe not a direct response, but I think that we're faced with these challenges, and frankly, I don't have, you know, there's no answer to this, but I think there's discussion around it that's important, and it's something that our grandchildren are going to have to live with, and I wish them good luck.
Should we have Citizens United and the money?
Well, that's absolutely, that's definitely. Now, that goes to the third branch of government, I would argue, and again, this is a philosophical thing, that, you know, the court has, you know, not distinguished itself in many ways. And, you know, which brings us to a whole series of other questions. You know, if Ruth Ginsburg, you know, so if a wind gets behind her tomorrow and blows her down, you know, we're going to get another appointment like the last one that we got. And Anthony Kennedy, who I'm not worried about the wind, but I don't know what's going to. So the court could change drastically in the next 12 to 18 months. And so all of these things are, I think, important. So, yes, Marion.
If the Democrats have a wave in November, if the Democrats have a wave, is it on?
It should be.
Okay. In November, maybe they could stall it like Merrick Garland.
Well, I think that's a good point. If they, no, what happened to this? Geez, it was when we started. Maybe the battery's out. Anyway, I'm sorry. No, it's not on. Thank you. So what Marion said was, if the Democrats, you know, have success in November, maybe they can stall the way Mr. McConnell stalled on the nomination of Merrick Garland. And yes.
Well, I'm worried about the Democrats as much as I am about the Republicans. We have, you know, this religious right, this far right area that's pulling away from the middle. And now we're going to have this far left that wants to pull away from the middle. So at a time when we really need to come together and cross the line to make decisions that are good for the country, we're going to be polarized even in this next election.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and I would add to that, and I don't know how the rest of you feel, that one of the things that's been very disappointing to me has been the inability of the Democrats to make a positive, what I would call in quotes, progressive, whatever that means, response. You can't be the party of no all the time. That doesn't work. And I think that this shutdown just was a perfect example of that. That there was an opportunity there to make positive presentations on a whole host of issues. And instead, we saw Mr. Schumer, who's a smart man. You know, every time you see him, he's looking down, unfortunately, you know, at the prepared text in front of him with his glasses on his nose. And, you know, I think it would be, if he just looked into the camera, I think it would be, that again is and I don't mean to keep coming back to Ted Kennedy, but that's the capability of being able to rouse an audience. Obama was able to do that. But he wasn't in Congress long enough to rise to that kind of that connection. But there have been other senators who were able to do that, and I think we've lost that. And the Democratic Party needs spokespeople, not just one, spokespeople who are able to explain to the American public what's happening here. And they're not doing it, in my view. They're really falling very short. I think Chuck and Nancy should be gone. There are plenty of young people who should have an opportunity to move up. And I think without it, they're missing a huge beat. Further, yes, Bob.
Well, most of us are uptight about Trump, not about the issues that you're just discussing of which party can express what they are for. You know, we get bombarded from the media, we get bombarded from the newspapers.
Yep.
And after after one or two antacids, but that's got the public so uptight.
Yes.
That I wonder when the public is going to blow up like they do in other countries that have had revolutions.
Yes.
That's not the American way.
After the stock market crashes.
After the stock market
The stock market would have to crash.
Maybe that would be the trigger that would tilt it. But the public is so uptight and so fed up and so uncertain what to do themselves, we're not going to come up with any kind of an answer except to talk to our spouse and get in trouble. Right?
And not vote for the incumbent.
No, it's not voting is not an
No,
answer.
I said not vote for the incumbent.
Whoever.
Not just continue the same.
So can we have further comment on this? Anybody want to jump in?
Being the
Let's just see if there's anybody who hasn't spoken on this. Go ahead.
being the party of no doesn't work for governing, but it works for maintaining power. And both sides, all they want is to maintain power and to get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
No one's interested in actually governing.
Dave?
I think there's an argument to be made against that and in favor of what Maynard was saying, was basically that there's no positive message that's coming out, and there's a whole generation of people who are looking for one. And back to the point about revolution, I think you really misread what it is that exists in terms of the public mind. First of all, 35–40% of Americans absolutely love the guy and believe that everything that he's doing is wonderful. They believe there's a secret society. They believe that there's a coup going on. They believe that he's dismissing all of these terrible people in government, getting rid of all sorts of regulation. That his policies are basically helping common people, even though they also help the rich. And what's wrong with helping the rich? I mean, there's a whole argument that they make, an impassioned argument, so that you're reading the tea leaves wrong. Then when you get to the point of how do you go about dealing with or pushing or winning a wave election, they blew it on the government shutdown. They absolutely blew it. And it'll show up in the polls. The question then becomes one of, will you actually see a wave? The probability is not.
Well, that's a percentage of voters, not Americans. One of the problems is, in order to have the revolution, we have to have more than 50% of the country voting. I mean, that's just ridiculous. If people really care, why aren't they voting?
Bev?
Okay, we're smart people here, right? What message should the Democrats be sending? Any ideas?
Proposing actual solutions.
Well, I think, Sandy?
As a former elected official, somebody's got to stand up for some of them. It's like when they say all politicians are crooks. There are people in Washington, and I could name them, who really want to make a difference. They have no voice. If you're in the minority, chopped liver does better than you do. Seriously, you have no power. But I think that one of the people talking about issues is Joe Biden. He's not in a position of power. But there are issues they could be talking to people in West Virginia and going through logical discussions about the disastrous health care proposal that they're going to lose the most. Issues like that, and they've got to start doing it. But I don't buy into nobody cares about anything but getting reelected. There probably are a lot of people, but there are good folks who want to make a difference.
Did you have a comment, Sheila?
Yeah, but I was.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think I actually said this on our very first meeting, that I've been drawn to, I have a cough drop. I've been drawn to writing my letters and making my phone calls to Republicans whom I see making a gesture that appears to be in the country's interest and not in party interest. And that's when, you know, John McCain says, why don't we have a process here where we're hearing from the public, where we are giving it time to read? I mean, that kind of thing, I think, is something that really deserves a reward, because that shows to me the kind of mindset. I don't agree with a lot of them.
Then you voted for the budget.
Yeah.
I know, I do know that, and I'm not gonna, I wouldn't vote for him, and when I write and I call and I say I'm an independent voter in New Hampshire, that sort of gives the hint that maybe if I were there, I'd vote for him. I never have. I said I probably wouldn't vote for most of what you will support on the floor of the Senate, but I see a gesture that is country above party.
This is
Beth.
not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, we go in there and we don't have we trounce on rich people. Everybody in this country wants to be rich. So trouncing on rich people doesn't really do it, because everyone says, well, if I want to make it and I want to get up there, and then I don't want to pay all those taxes when people aren't working. So we have to have a message that says, you know what? We want you to get rich. And right now, the people who are on the top don't really want you to get rich. They're playing by their rules. Or something like that. That is a different message than we care about poor people, we care about DACA, we care about health care, because that's not working.
Well, it certainly doesn't. Let's put it this way. It's not working. Are these the wrong issues, or are they being approached the wrong way? You know, the business, I think you make a very interesting point about, you know, rich and not so rich. Remember, one of those comments that I had in the prologue was, the more there is for me, the less there is for you. You know, to some extent, I think, you know, I think that's a truism for some people. So to me, you have to first find the issues. I don't think the issues are that hard to find. But the question is, how do you approach them? What do you say about these issues? And is what's happening, I think, is that regardless of where you are on the issues, the Republicans seem to have the better message, and they seem to be more polished about their presentation. Dave was just at the break giving me an example that I think the kinds of things we've all seen on the radio shows, where the interviewer, you know, proposes questions, and whoever they're interviewing just gives them the standard response, ignoring the questions completely, and just, you know, it just keeps going. It's like you wind up the ever-ready bunny, and you just keep getting this back time after time. And so I think the Democrats need to revamp their message machine. I think, you know, the issues are not hard, but they need to find a way to make better presentations. And I think they've got some very smart, attractive people in Congress, and I don't know why they don't use them more effectively. Mike.
So they had that with the Bowles-Simpson proposal, and Obama never took it. It's not going to get all passed, but it was a talking point of the issues, and you know that he lost my vote for that. I didn't vote for it at the time.
Right.
But just because of that.
Well,
and that's what we need, some way to get
together.
Yeah, and that was a way to do it. That was a starting point.
It was. It was.
That's a good point. Sure, we need to get together. It seems that Trump, only Trump, his nasty, rotten personality is what gets most people burned up. And they can't even talk about policy. They can't even talk about issues. They're just busy hating Trump. And he deserves all the hate, in my opinion. But, you know, if the other 40 or 50% who aren't gung-ho for Trump, if we're preoccupied and troubled by one Trump, we're not going to put any of, no portion of our brain is going to get into issues.
Okay?
That's true.
I think somebody who hasn't spoken.
Over here.
Roy.
Somebody just mentioned John McCain, and in relation to what this gentleman said, I think one of the worst things that Trump has ever said when he castigated John McCain for being captured in the Vietnam War. This GD draft dodger, the most outrageous thing to say, but his followers.
Yeah, they loved it.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And I think the one regrettable thing, I think McCain is certainly an honorable man, and has certainly served his country honorably. But his major mistake undoubtedly was naming Sarah Palin as running mate. That has to be one of the biggest presidential pick blunders in the country's history.
Well, it looks like, we haven't seen the senator. I think he obviously is, his health is not great. And I don't know, I have no idea what's happening, but he certainly had the reputation, I think, beyond the actuality. But I remember when he came to New Hampshire in that presidential campaign back in, what was it, 2000, 2004, 8, and in 8. And he came to New Hampshire and he was speaking in New London. And we went down to see him at the town hall, and it was in February. And his campaign he was dead. I mean, he got off that bus, nobody knew it at the time. It was a huge bus. He was doing a big bus tour in New Hampshire and New England, I think. There were 2 people on the bus, McCain and his press guy. And he had not a dime, nothing. And he came into that hall, and the place was packed. New London's a big Republican town. There were a lot of people there. It was jammed, and he conducted one of those town meetings. And I got to tell you, he was fabulous. I mean, he was on, and he answered the questions, and he was great. We left, and I said to the guy I was with, who was a former Republican legislator in New Hampshire for some time, and I said to him, that was a hell of a presentation. And he went on, that was like the bottom. He went on and eventually, as you know, won the nomination. So he did have, and has had over his career, a certain charisma, a certain way, a certain ability, and in some cases, not as many as I think he'd like us to believe, but in some cases, he's definitely had the ability to step across the aisle and country first. That clearly was part of his background and his service record, absolutely. So I think he's certainly entitled to all those plaudits that he gets for that. Marty?
I think one of the factors that has gotten us to the place we are now with the polarization that hasn't been mentioned yet is news coverage. I'll just say it, Fox News. Now, I'll admit I'm not a Fox News fan. I turn it on because I think it's important to listen to all sides of the coin. I have a short fuse, and that's just, so I clearly understand why people who are fans might find other stations objectionable. Mm-hmm. But I think it's if you look at the gap between what one news organization is presenting as news and what another news organization is presenting as, it's guaranteed polarization.
Sandy?
I don't mean to be Pollyanna, but the most recent special elections in Wisconsin was won. Around the country, the Democrats have done well. Can they do more? Absolutely. I think that's one thing we should remember. It isn't all doom and gloom. And the other thing is there are discussions going on and there are groups meeting. There are 2 national ones. It's a group that meets in Etna and they're talking about what can we do, what issues can we work on, how do we get to people. But I will tell everyone, if you're not from the state of a senator, they take your letter.
Yeah.
They don't give a rip. It's very sad, but they really don't care. You have to get your friends in those states to write to them.
Bob?
I just, listening to it all, I've kind of concluded that as a country, we get the government that we deserve. And that's kind of unfortunate to say, but like she said, when 50% of the people can't be bothered to participate, and the remaining 50% are by choice or by whatever means are divided out into warring camps that don't cross the aisle and talk to each other. This is the result. This is what we get. And the only way to really overcome that is to encourage everybody to take an interest, to really look at what's going on.
So in the in the midterm elections, historically, the turnout has been
50%.
dreadful. It's no less than 50%.
No, it's 50% of the presidential, at least in Hanover.
Well, we have, the numbers are the eligible registered voters, the ERV, is down in 2014, it was 37%. So that was about as bad as since 1960. I don't think we've ever hit 50%. So, what's going to happen in 2018? I don't know the answer to that. Yes,
I think one thing that we have not talked about is we've talked about how emotionally driven the 2 sides seem to be motivated. But if you have not read a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, by somebody Hofschild, who read it too.
Oh, yeah.
It's an extraordinary look at both the mind, but more important, the emotional state.
Right.
People who voted for Trump and who have voted, who are look at Fox News. But I think at the very end, what becomes really clear is that those of us who pride ourselves in being left-leaning liberals or centrist liberal side, how emotional it is for us too. Because as she points out, the people on both sides, their way of life is deeply threatened by this situation. And for us, we're seeing the Department of Education decimated, federal laws that took generations to develop, be vitiated, and one thing after another. And she describes it as the public space where the institutions that we most value are being completely undermined. Well, the people on the right have the same sort of set of extraordinarily emotional things that they are dealing with, and their response is to basically elect a screw you kind of a president and to trust the people who are telling them that their lives are going to get better. And it is not a rational place for any of us to be functional.
So as the bottom line, I think, in a sense, is 60 million people voted for Mr. Trump. So that's a lot of people, no matter how you slice it. I think if we had the election today, I'm not sure that number would be a lot different. I think pretty close to the same 60 million. It may be that more people would come out. Some of the people who didn't come out on the other side, either because they were mad about Bernie, or they didn't like Hillary, or they didn't feel that, whatever, maybe that side would get more votes. But I'm not convinced that 60 million would change all that much.
But he's losing women, and he's losing the suburbanites from every recent poll.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, he seems to be gaining,
White men.
Yeah, white men, yes. White men, yes. Hey, guys. Yes, Tim.
How many of those 60 million were actually voting against Hillary?
Well, there's a fair question. I can't answer that.
There were a lot.
Yep. So maybe if it was somebody else, you would see a different thing.
In the midterms.
Yeah, no, in the midterms, that's not an issue. Sue?
On the basic level, how do you get civics back into the
Excuse me.
classroom?
What's that?
How do you get civics back into the classroom?
Well, I think that's we made that point earlier. They don't teach civics anymore in school.
Is that not us?
They do.
They teach it in Lebanon, but they teach it in the 9th grade. And I don't think 9th graders really have an appreciation for the Constitution. I think they should teach it the senior year after you have a good history of other areas.
So first they need to teach it, and then they need to teach it in the right in the right continuum. Yes, Faith.
I think the immigration is a huge thing. We don't see it as much here in the Northeast, but there's a huge perception that all these immigrants are coming away and coming in and taking away from us. That there's not enough to go around, and it's immigrants' fault.
And the federal Florida government
And
is
the what?
enabling that.
Oh, yeah, but it's a fear-based vote, and people, I think Trump supporters are just ecstatic about everything he's doing to suppress immigration. And the idea is that, there'll be more for us if they're not here.
Well,
And right now, we support DACA, but those people don't vote. So the Democrats are supporting a group that can't even vote for us.
But the whole Hispanic community does vote.
well, they do. And yet, no, they do. And yet, in part of those, there were places, again, because of the disparity of the vote, in California, where you have a very large number of the Hispanic population, in Texas, in maybe in Nevada. To some extent, those votes are, quote unquote, wasted, because in California, for example, because those are so heavily Democratic populated. But anyway, this is part of a discussion that we can continue during our discussions over the 2018 midterms, when there'll be 435 seats in the Congress, 33 seats in the Senate, and I think 36 gubernatorial spots open, including, of course, New Hampshire and Vermont, because we're the only states left in the Union that have 2-year gubernatorial terms. Go figure that. Anyway.
And of those 450, only about 100 are in play. And that's the one.
Well, I think that's another interesting point. Yes, Rich.
And in the House of Representatives, there's a significant number of sitting Republicans who are not running for re-election.
There seem to be. Well, that's an interesting question. I think there are about 30 at least. There are a few Democrats. But what kinds of seats they are, what kinds of opportunities there are. But I think, yes, there's certainly, to me, that's another indication that there are a lot of people who, they've got their pension, they don't want to play anymore. This is not a game that's any fun. And they're tired, right. Yes?
We haven't discussed or mentioned voter suppression in some of these states. And there are 2 cases of gerrymandering that are going to court right now in North Carolina and I think
Pennsylvania.
Yeah. But I'm thinking in Texas and a lot of these southern states suppressing people not being, and what we did in New Hampshire, we're not going to let students who attend.
The ACLU will challenge.
Yeah, I don't know where we are on that, but I think that's another point. And gerrymandering, of course, that's another, that's another course, another time, another place. But clearly, that has been a very important issue. The Republicans picked that up in the early 2000s, and in 2012 they basically changed the map. And they changed the map not only for the national elections, but they've changed the map for the state and local elections around the country. So that's something that's been a fact, and how the court has weighed in or will weigh in remains, I think, to be seen. So
a lot of those the gerrymandering cases aren't going to probably really have effect in the next.
Well, that's right. Well, it's very not in the next election, but I think the the North Carolina one could, and the Pennsylvania one could. So yes, and the census in 2020 will be the basis on which the next generation of these cases will develop. And there have been a whole series of questions I've seen about what questions are going to be asked on the census now, which could tip, the way these things are counted. So we can politicize almost anything. I think this has been to me, very interesting discussion. I'd like to move forward. I think we've got a couple of other topics that I'd like to touch on before we conclude. Any other questions about the 25th Amendment? It's never been used. I think there's a good chance, a likelihood, that we may not, I speak for myself, I may not live to see it ever used. One of the key questions, I have to make this point, my 17-year-old grandson is an aide to Congressman Raskin in Maryland. He is, let me see if I can get this right, he's the deputy legislative correspondent, which means that he's in charge of the mailroom. And anyway, he's finishing high school, and he was just admitted to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which he's very excited. But Congressman Raskin has introduced a bill which I think is kind of interesting, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. It is a bill to establish a process to determine presidential disability. Where the hell is it? I don't know why I'm having trouble finding these things. This looks like it. Oh. What it does is establishes a commission of 12 people, I believe, to be appointed by Congress, who would be, they could not be sitting members of Congress, they could not be employed by the federal government, they could not be members of the armed forces, but they could, in fact, have had that in their background or their experience. They would all be physicians. And I believe half are to be psychiatrists. And I think the process was that several of these people would be appointed by the Republicans in the House, several by the Democrats in the House, several by Republicans in the Senate, several by Democrats in the Senate, and then the group would in turn choose a chairperson. And basically it would be their job to conduct, when requested, a medical evaluation of the president. So this would be done under the 25th Amendment.
Who would request it?
Well, that's a fair question. Presumably, Congress. I doubt that a president would request it. It's possible under the 25th Amendment that the vice president or that group might request it. But basically, this would be the group that would evaluate the president's disability, or I think the word that it's used is inability. So I have a couple of questions about this. So what happens if the president says, I don't want to play? Nobody's going to examine me. I'm the healthiest guy in the world. So the answer, at least in the current proposed legislation, is Congress will take that into account in their evaluation of the president. So this is, I think there were 20 congressmen who signed, went on to this. I don't think this is going anywhere, but it's one perhaps thoughtful approach to how to implement one piece of this amendment. And so you may, I did see a couple of weeks ago some reference to this in the news, and you may see some reference to this Raskin bill as time moves on. So now let's turn to, I think, a question that we've all referenced. Can the president pardon himself? So let me get your, one of the materials that I provided to you at the beginning was this law review article by Brian Colt, I think, who's written actually fairly extensively on this and some related questions. And his position, as you will know if you've looked at this, is that the president can't pardon himself. But I can tell you that there are many commentators who believe that the president can pardon himself. So I'd like to hear from you whether you've read the full law review article or not, what your thoughts are on this and why, what your take is. Should the president be able to put, yes, Mike?
Well, he'd only be able to pardon himself in the future because he has to be president to be able to pardon himself. So he has to be convicted first before he can pardon himself, unless he can take the forward future.
Well, we've talked about the possibility of these preemptive pardons.
Yeah, right, have to be a preemptive.
Right. So he could say, if he could pardon himself, he could use the Nixon approach, which was, I pardon myself for any and all crimes between the time I got into office and whatever the day is. And I suppose he could use the same language that Ford used, and any other crimes that I may commit going forward. Whoa, there's one. I mean, where does that leave off? So you've raised one interesting question, but certainly in terms of past events, he could take the position that he was pardoning himself. So what would be the response? What are some of the alternate responses that you could see? Is this a constitutional crisis all by itself? The president says, I'm pardoning myself, and so what else might happen? Would he step down? Would this be the last day of his term? Would he say, and by the way, I declare my candidacy for running for re-election? I mean, what happens what's your take here, Bob?
Okay, if he can pardon himself, then I suggest we read Germany's history and the creation of the Third Reich. Hitler was legally elected. And you know what he turned out to be. Wouldn't the president, if he could pardon himself, just tell the public that, okay, public, you have elected a dictator who can run anything and everything he chooses, or some maybe milder way of saying it.
Okay. George.
Being the 15 opinions, two things stand out in my mind. One was very short, which says, why are we even talking about this? And the other was, we don't know.
Yes. Mr. Dershowitz wrote an opinion, and he said basically we don't have an answer. But what he was saying there, was he not, is that should someone choose to do this, you know, it would go to the court. Yes? Someone would have to bring a lawsuit. Query, who has standing to bring that lawsuit? Whoa. I mean, do you and I have standing to bring it as individuals, as American citizens? Does the Democratic Party have standing to bring it as a political party? Do the states have standing to bring it? Does Congress have authority to bring such a suit? Who would bring this suit? Richard?
The League of Women Voters.
Well, okay, no, that's another, right, the League of Women Voters.
What about the Justice Department?
Well, can you see the Justice Department bringing an action against the president? I think, you know, that's, I would say that's not likely, but it's a question. I mean, I wonder about this. I haven't lost a lot of sleep over it, but I do wonder about it, Dave.
Is there a way, or can you contemplate a way by which pardons can be overdone or overcome?
Overruled?
Overruled.
So we talked briefly about this back, I think, early on, and I think one of the things we suggested was that pardons were not, it didn't appear that they were reviewable by the judicial branch. Now, I think this is, another question I asked in the email was, could Congress pardon the president? So Congress doesn't have a pardon power. But if the president can't pardon himself, why couldn't Congress pardon the president?
They don't have legal authority to.
We don't have that authority.
Well, they don't have it in the Constitution. I would agree with that. Could they pass a law? Remember, if the president can't pardon himself, he's the only person in the country who can't be pardoned.
That makes sense.
If Congress passes a law, it has to be signed by the president. So you already have a problem. If Congress passes a law and then it gets reviewed in the judiciary, it can be declared unconstitutional.
Yes, that's true.
In fact, it's not in the Constitution. The question I asked was, can Congress overcome or overturn a pardon?
Well, I think we have no history on that point. So I think the way the Constitution currently reads, and from the little case law that there is, it would appear that the answer to your question is no. Congress can't overcome a pardon. I think we said earlier that even if a pardon or pardons were issued for fraud, for a payment, or for any other illegal reason, those pardons are probably valid. In other words, there's no way for the general public to overcome those. The people who are involved in the fraud could be charged with a crime, but that wouldn't invalidate the pardon that was issued. So the question that I'm posing is kind of the other side of the coin, which is, you know, what about, is it fair, maybe that's not the right word, for the president to be the only person in the country who can't be pardoned? And if he can't pardon himself, then why shouldn't Congress be able to pardon him? And let me just take this one step further. If Congress passes the law, why wouldn't the president sign the law? I mean, now, the next question is, well, somebody could take that to the court, and the court would say, yay, nay. We don't know what the court would say. But again, I think this is a whole series of interesting questions which have not been posed because they haven't happened. And I think there's no way to know whether these things might happen. But I think that we're closer to having those things happen than we've ever been in our history. That's my view. I mean, Nixon had his issues, there's no doubt. He was troubled at the end. You know, hit that famous line, I am not a crook. I don't know, how many of you have been to the Nixon Library? You know, one of the interesting things about the Nixon Library, I think, is the amount of space they've devoted to Watergate. I have to tell you, it's very interesting. If you go to the Reagan Library, you can't find Iran-Contra anywhere. It's there, but it's buried in a corner. You have to practically tear down the wall in order to find it. It's a totally different presentation and a handling of responsibility and what history really was. It's kind of interesting in that respect. So, and Clinton, you know, that's yet another story. I think what we're talking about now is something really that's totally different. This game isn't over, and I certainly, you know, am not the great prognosticator, but I am very concerned about a constitutional crisis, however it's defined. I think that our current president is apt to do almost anything at any time for any reason. And I think that's dangerous for anybody in any situation. And I think he started when he came down the escalator and talked about the Mexicans. And, well, that's true. But these conspiracies which float around the White House and now the country and the world are pretty staggering. And you guys brought up, I think, some very important points as in that past conversation that we had. And I don't have the answers, but I do know that we need to be vigilant, and we need to try the best we can not to beat on somebody's head, but to find a way to bridge this divide, not just with the president, but with the political parties. I don't know whether we've come to the end of this two-party system, whether we'll see a viable third party or maybe even a fourth. I don't know the answer to that, but there has to be a better way than this. And we're in a kind of a bubble here in Hanover and Norwich and the Upper Valley, and I think that's good in many ways, but it also, I think, leads us to you know, some blinders. We're not hit in the face with some of the problems of reality until, you know, the president says, well, you know, I won in New Hampshire because they bust in thousands of illegal immigrants. You know, we all know that's a crock. And then, you know, our Secretary of State goes on the commission and you know, I don't know where Mr. Gardner is. That's another story. So I think that this is, you know, really the issue of our time, the political issue of our time. And I think that your participation in these kinds of events is important. It's critical. Suzanne often says to me, "How did the class go?" And I say, "Well, I don't know about them, but I had a terrific time." So I want you to know I've had a terrific time. And I've enjoyed this. I wish it was longer. I think we could have had more discussion over more topics. We never did get to the rule of law. I can tell you that if you want to start with Aristotle and work your way through the Montesquieu and all of the great philosophers who had talked about this, you know, we would come up, I think, saying, let's order another round of drinks. But it's a very important concept in all of this, because no man is above the law is the basis for it all. And I think that's something that our current president has never understood, and certainly doesn't understand now. So thank you again.
Fill out the form.
Oh yes, if you haven't filled out the evaluation form, Fabulous is Fabulous.
His pay depends on.
Thanks again, guys.